Good morning, everyone. Today, I would like to speak about the importance of beneficial action in our lives. Beneficial action refers to any action that's helpful or beneficial to ourselves and others. In other words, it's an action that brings happiness, peace, and well-being, both to ourselves and to those around us. The Buddha once said, "Do not overlook tiny good actions, thinking they are of no benefit. Even tiny drops of water in the end will fill a huge vessel." This quotation reminds us that even the smallest acts of kindness, compassion, and generosity can have a significant impact on both ourselves and others. Every day, we have countless opportunities to engage in beneficial actions. We can show kindness to a stranger, listen attentively to a friend, offer a helping hand to someone in need, or simply smile at a passerby. Each of these actions can make a positive difference in the world and create a ripple effect of kindness and goodwill. The practice of beneficial action is central to many spiritual traditions, including Buddhism, of course. In fact, the Buddha taught that our actions are the most important factor in determining our present and future happiness. According to the law of karma, every action we take, whether positive or negative, creates a ripple effect that shapes our present and future experiences. Therefore, by engaging in beneficial actions, we are not only creating positive karma for ourselves, but also contributing to the well-being of our world. Our actions have the power to uplift and inspire others, creating a more positive and harmonious environment for all. It's important to remember that beneficial action does not need to be grandiose or heroic. It can be as simple as holding the door open for someone or offering a kind word to a stranger. Even the smallest acts of kindness can have a powerful impact on someone's life. The practice of beneficial action is thus a simple yet powerful way to cultivate happiness, peace, and well-being in our lives and the lives of others. By making a conscious effort to engage in acts of kindness, compassion, and generosity, we can create a more positive and harmonious world for all. May we all be inspired to engage in beneficial action in our daily lives and create a more peaceful and compassionate world for all beings. So I have a confession to make. I didn't write any of that. A computer wrote that. So perhaps some of you have heard in the news recently that there are these artificial intelligence chatbots. So I was kind of messing around with these around the same time that I was writing this talk, and I just wondered what would happen if I put in write a Dharma talk on beneficial action in Buddhism, and this is what it gave me. Which is pretty impressive. It's a little repetitive and kind of general, but and the reason that I wanted to include this, other than for the novelty of it, was because this term beneficial action, I think when we see it, our immediate response is to be like, oh, that means like a good deed. But there's a big sort of history behind this word and a whole sort of chain of translations that happen to get this term to us. And it has a specialized meaning that goes beyond what this artificial intelligence thought it meant. So even though the AI is pretty good, it's not able to pick up on that kind of subtlety and know that this has sort of a deeper meaning in the Buddhist tradition. So from here on, I did write the rest, or at least compile the rest, full disclosure. So best as I could tell, so to back up, talk that Hoko gave last week was about the Bodaisatta Shishobo. So for embracing actions is one possible translation. There are many others. I'll get into it. I wanted to trace this list back as far as I could, and so I started with the Pali Canon. And as best as I can tell, it occurs 3 times in the Pali Canon, this list of 4 embracing actions. And the first one that I found, I can give you the full Pali. I studied a little Sanskrit in semester, so I might as well use it and read this. So it's Katari Sangavatuni Danam Peyavajam Attakarya Samanatatata. So that's like the whole thing. That's all it says about these 4 embracing actions. And so the Katari means 4. sort of sounds like cuatro or something in Spanish, because it is an Indo-European language, so they share a common origin. And then Sanghavatuni. So Sanghavatuni, so the Sangha part sort of sounds like Sangha, and they are related words. It means sort of to assemble or collect. And the Vatuni, which is Vastu in Sanskrit, means sort of like a base or a foundation. So it's sort of 4 grounds of collecting or 4 grounds of assembling is literally what it means. And then the next part is just the listing of the 4 things. So generosity, kind speech, beneficial action, which I'll be primarily focusing on today, and what identity action is how it's translated in Hojo-san's version of Dogen's text. So in this case, the one that I'll focus on is this Atta Karya, which is the one that gets translated as beneficial action. And the most sort of brutally literal kind of translation, I think, would be something like advantageous conduct or conduct that is advantageous for others. And the way that the translators of this passage chose to render it, this is Bhikkhu Sujata. He says 4 ways of being inclusive. So instead of embracing actions, he says 4 ways of being inclusive. Giving, kindly words, taking care, and equality. So taking care is what he says for beneficial actions, taking care of others. Another translation, an older one, this is by Rhys David, who was one of the sort of colonial era translators of Pali and Sanskrit. So he writes, 4 grounds of popularity, to wit, liberality, kindly speech, justice, and impartiality. So he's using justice for beneficial action here, and grounds of popularity for embracing action. The next instance in which I found it is translated by Bhikkhu Sujato as the following. So mendicants. There are these 4 ways of being inclusive. So again, he's using the same inclusive, it's the same guy. So what for? Giving, kindly words, taking care, and equality. These are 4 ways of being inclusive. Giving and kindly words, taking care here, and equality in worldly conditions, in each case as they deserve. These ways of being inclusive in the world are like a moving chariot's linchpin. If there were no such ways of being inclusive, neither mother nor father would be respected and honored for what they've done for their children. So this is kind of interesting here. If there were no such ways of being inclusive, neither mother nor father would be respected and honored for what they've done to their children, for their children. So what it's sort of pointing out here is, that we respect our elders, hopefully, on the basis of them sort of taking care of us, being generous with us, using loving speech with us, and treating us as their equals, hopefully, eventually. So in this way, there's this parallel case. But since these ways of being inclusive do exist, the astute do regard them well, so they achieve greatness and are praised. So that's the end of this little sutta. And the third one, I think, is kind of the most interesting. And this one is called With Hataka. So Hataka is a layperson. So at one time, the Buddha was staying near Alavi at the Agalava tree shrine. Then the householder Hataka of Alavi, escorted by around 500 lay followers, went up to the Buddha, bowed, and sat down to one side. The Buddha said to Hataka, "Hataka, you have a large congregation. How do you bring together such a large congregation?" Hataka says, "Sir, I bring together such a large congregation by using the 4 ways of being inclusive, as taught by the Buddha." So again, this is translated by Sujato again, so it's the same, being inclusive. "When I know that a person can be included by a gift, I include them by giving a gift. When I know that a person can be included by kindly words, I include them by kindly words. When I know that a person can be included by taking care of them, I include them by taking care of them. When I know that a person can be included by equality, I include them by treating them equally. But also," and this is sort of a weird part at the end here, "but also, sir, my family is wealthy. They wouldn't think that a poor person was worth listening to in the same way. So also be rich, maybe. Bhikkhu Bodhi also translated this, and he renders that a little bit differently. I can't tell if he's trying to change the meaning to make it sound better, or if it's really can be read this way. But Bhikkhu Bodhi says instead, "There is wealth in my family, Bhante." Bhante is a word for the Buddha. They don't think that they should listen to me as if I were poor. So maybe that's the real meaning, hopefully. And then the Buddha says in response, "Good, good, Hataka. This is the right way of bringing together a large congregation. Whether in the past, future, or present, all those who have brought together a large congregation have done so by using these 4 ways of being inclusive." And then it ends, then the Buddha educated, encouraged, fired up, and inspired Hataka of Alavi with a Dharma talk. After which he got up from his seat, bowed, and respectfully circled the Buddha before leaving. Then, not long after Hataka had left, the Buddha addressed the mendicants. "Mendicants, you should remember the householder Hataka of Alavi as someone who has 8 amazing and incredible qualities." What 8? He's faithful, ethical, conscientious, prudent, learned, generous, wise, and has few wishes. You should remember the householder Hataka of Alavi as someone who has these 8 amazing and incredible qualities. So those are the 3 instances in which I could find it in the Pali Canon. I also happen to have this book, which is sort of the Chinese version, so to speak, of the Pali Canon. It's not perfectly parallel most of the time, but it does happen to have this same text in it. And the first part of it is generally identical, more or less. It leaves out the being rich part, which I thought was interesting. So it doesn't say anything about like, but I am rich and therefore they listen to me. That's left out. But one thing that I thought was sort of interesting is there's a footnote right after he lists the 4 beneficial, 4 embracing actions. So it says, charitable giving is the first, speaking friendly words is the second, providing helpful advice is the third, and being impartial is the fourth. And in his footnote to this version, he says, the 4 embracing actions are not translated clearly in the Chinese. Our translation relies heavily on the Pali version. So he's already sort of signaling that there's going to be some ambiguity when this transfers over to the Chinese tradition. So all of this sort of taken together let me see, hold on, did I have this list in here? I had a list at one point of the different sort of possible translations. Okay, yeah, so the 4 embracing actions can be variously translated as 4 grounds of collecting, 4 ways of being inclusive, we saw that, 4 grounds of popularity, we saw that too. And then Bhikkhu Bodhi has 4 means of sustaining a favorable relationship. When I looked it up in the Digital Dictionary of Buddhism, it gives 4 means of conversion. Wayman, who translated the Srimala Sutra, he also says 4 articles of conversion. And in the Tibetan sort of online encyclopedia, they have 4 ways of attracting disciples. So what all this, I think, kind of means is the idea here was not so much the same as what we get in Dogen, of this idea of embracing sentient beings. It's more, how do you convert people? How do you bring them into your Sangha? And that seems quite different in a lot of ways from what we see when we look at this text from the Chinese tradition side. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of proselytization and proselytization. I've never been able to pronounce that very well. And sort of, our discomfort with it. I mean, it is a sort of an explicitly negative word, the way that it's used. In its origin, it uses Greek roots and it just means newcomer. So like, how do you bring newcomers in? But over time, of course, it sort of gathered this negative connotation. And the Dalai Lama, had some comments about this, and he critiques this sort of bringing in of people just for the sake of bringing them in. So he says, It's very important that our religious traditions live in harmony with one another, and I don't think proselytizing contributes to this. Just as fighting and killing in the name of religion are very sad, it's not appropriate to use religion as a ground or a means for defeating others. And I think that this is absolutely true. And I think it's also worth noting that these four embracing actions, or four means of conversion, whatever you want to call them, are clearly not doing that, right? They're not using religion just as a way of kind of battering other people or bringing them in. And we get this in Buddhism too. So like the Nichiren tradition in Japan, they use this phrase for converting people called break and subdue. And they sort of argue that it's for people's own good. You have to break them of what they believe and subdue them, into your fold. Obviously, for us, that's not good, I don't think. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that at the end of the day, a big part of our practice is about helping all sentient beings, and we have to find some kind of middle ground where we're not just like trying to swell our numbers for the sake of swelling numbers, but we're also not like so queasy about it that anytime someone shows up here, we're not even going to look at them because we're afraid that we're going to seem like we're proselytizing to them. So I think what this list of four shows is this was something that early Buddhists thought about was how can we make people comfortable and set them up to live in a healthy, wholesome way as we understand it. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. So moving on from there, there is one other notable text where this list shows up sort of extensively, and that is an important Mahayana text that's called the Mahayana Sutra Alamkara. And this is like one of these sort of really dense philosophical texts from the Yogacara tradition. It's attributed to Maitreya. So Maitreya is the future Buddha, but scholars aren't sure if maybe this actually was like a person who just happened to have the Dharma name Maitreya, or if they were trying to attribute it to the future Buddha. But at any rate, Asanga, who's like sort of the first kind of patron of the Yogacara tradition, and his student Vasubandhu both wrote commentaries that are sort of included within this text. And I didn't really have time to study this thing in detail, and it's written in verse, and you sort of have to rely on commentaries and stuff. So, but one little sort of tidbit that I pulled from it is it says of these four, basically, generosity creates vessels. So vessels of the Dharma. We hear Dogen talking about this. So by being kind to people, we sort of open up the possibility, of maybe them seeing that this practice is a good one, and they might be willing to sort of listen to what we have to say. Of course, it's not solely for the reason of getting them to listen to us that we do that. Generosity is good for its own sake, but it does have this effect, according to this text, of creating vessels. Loving speech creates devotion, he says next. Beneficial action creates practice. So there's this tie-in with practice. And identity action creates thorough training, he says. So, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I like this kind of idea that what he's talking about with beneficial action relates directly to our practice. It's sort of more of a, kind of practice-based action more than anything else. Okay, so now let's move into the Chinese tradition. So in the version of this text that we're most likely to have studied, which is Hojo-san's translation, he uses four embracing actions. He wrote in his commentary that in an earlier version, he wrote four embracing dharmas. And this is, again, because of the ambiguity of language. So the word dharma is sort of the same word that's used for something like method in Chinese and Japanese. So when you see it, you could make either choice. Is it saying dharmas? Is it saying method? It's not clear. But in this case, since we do have the original phrase and it doesn't say dharma, which is Sanskrit, so it should say dharma if it's dharma, and it doesn't, so Hojo-san picked actions, four actions. Tom, who's their student of Uchiyama Roshi, wrote four ways, and then sort of in brackets, for a bodhisattva to act. So 4 ways to act. And Nishijima Roshi, in his translation of the Shobogenzo, he has 4 elements, again in brackets, of a bodhisattva's social relations. So this one's sort of maybe midway between these 2 ideas. Okay, so here's the difficulty with translating this word. so the 4 is not a problem, right? We talked about the last one, method or way. Basically, any of those kind of work, ways, actions, articles, grounds. All these things sort of mean roughly the same thing, so that's not really the problem. The difficulty is with the second character, the Shishobo, so the sho. This character isn't really used much in modern Japanese. It shows up in some words in modern Chinese. So one example is in the word for a magnet. So it's that character sho plus stone. So it's like attracting stone, a stone that attracts. But here's what you get when you look it up in the dictionary, this character. To take in, to absorb, to extract. 2, to take a photograph. 3, to hold, to grasp, to drag. 4, to manage, to command, to administer. 5, to act as an agent, to be a representative, to act as a proxy. 6, to arrest, to apprehend. 7, to draw, to attract. 8, to assist. 9, to be squeezed in between. 10, to maintain one's health, to keep fit. And 11, a rhyme group, a rhyme class, one of 16 sets of such in Middle Chinese. In the one semester of Sanskrit that I took, I often heard this joke related to Sanskrit studies, and that is that every word in Sanskrit means itself, its opposite, the name of a god, a word for an elephant, and a position in sexual intercourse. And it's sort of the same for classical Chinese. So this is, a very long list of definitions. So how do we pick which one is correct here? So another sort of clue that we have in this character is, Chinese characters are usually composed of parts. Some of them just sort of look like the thing they mean, like the character for person sort of looks like a little stick figure. But most of them have like one part that indicates its meaning and another part that indicates its pronunciation. So this character has the 2 parts. One is hand and one is ear. So the ear part is the phonetic part, so that's the sound part, but the hand part is the meaning part. So something like embrace sort of works, or to attract, all those things kind of work. I mentioned one of these definitions is to hold, to grasp. So it seems that the direction that this went in once it was translated into Chinese was this embracing idea, this idea of grasping and holding, and not so much this assembling or gathering that was sort of the original meaning. And this is what happens with translation. We have to be careful about it, I think, as Buddhists, because we're working at the end of a long line of translations. And we have to remember too that Dogen, did not speak Sanskrit or Pali and had no access to those texts. And most of the Chinese canon had sort of already been set by like the 6th, 7th century. So these things had already been in use for hundreds and hundreds of years before Dogen was working on them. So he had no reason to doubt and be like, oh, maybe this translation is not quite right. These were canonical texts in translation. So when we read Dogen, it doesn't necessarily help us to know what the original Sanskrit meaning was, because he was just reading it in Chinese. So Dogen's use of this phrase is going to fundamentally be a little bit different from the way that it was used by other people. One thing here that I'll say too is regarding the translations of beneficial actions, of the ostensible topic of my talk today. So beneficial action is Hojo-san's translation. Tom Wright says actions benefiting all beings. The Digital Dictionary of Buddhism has altruistic acts. Nishijima has helpful conduct. Wayman from the Srimala Sutra translation has concordant acts. So we get more of this, this feel of helpfulness, benefiting. So this doesn't really change a whole lot from the from the Pali and Sanskrit versions. And the characters that make up this beneficial action, the first one is used a lot in modern Japanese compounds, and it means something like profit. So something that's profitable for someone else or beneficial by extension. And then the second part is action. It's like most commonly just used in the word to mean to go. But in our tradition especially, it means something more like an action or a comport or something like that. So let me read Dogen's comments on beneficial action, and we can kind of go from there. So this is Hojo-san's translation. So again, this is from Bodaisatta Shishobo, so the Bodhisattvas for embracing actions. So beneficial action means creating skillful means to benefit living beings, whether they are noble or humble. For example, we care for the near and distant future of others and use skillful means to benefit them. We should take pity on a cornered tortoise and care for a sick sparrow. When we see this tortoise or sparrow, we try to help it without expecting any reward. We are motivated solely by beneficial action itself. So this refers to a couple of stories that Hojo-san comments on in his writing about this text. And this story about the tortoise so it's actually a turtle, because he puts it in the water. You shouldn't put a tortoise in the water. But it's about a person named Kong Yu, who lived in the Jin dynasty in China. And basically he encounters some person who's carrying this turtle on its back, and it's out of the water and it's not looking happy at all. And he, sees that it's suffering, and he says, "Oh, let me buy this from you." And then he takes it to a lake and returns it. And it said that the turtle sort of looks over his shoulder as if to thank him as it's swimming away. And then later in life, this person becomes the governor of this territory. And one of his tasks when he starts this position is he has to carve his own stele, his stamp. And he decided to put a turtle on the stamp. But whenever it comes back from someone making it, it has this turtle looking over its left shoulder. And he's like, "Oh, that's weird." And then he sends it back and he's like, "Maybe do it again," And again, it comes back with the turtle leaning over his left shoulder. And it's said that he realizes that he wouldn't have gotten his position without this turtle looking out for him, essentially. So the point being here is that, and this is what Hojo-san says, so he shows that these helping activities arise solely from a compassionate heart rather than a calculating mind. So he writes, Hojo-san writes, "So here is a paradox. When a person performs a beneficial action without expecting any reward, that person receives some benefit in return for that action." So obviously this guy wasn't expecting the turtle to give him some reward for saving him. It's a turtle, obviously they can't really do much for us. But as it turns out, this turtle watches out for him somehow, and he becomes the governor of this state. So, however, if a person helps others with some expectation of a reward, such actions essentially become a means of barter, therefore producing no reward. So if we're just sort of, it's similar to the proselytization, if we're doing it just to bring them over to our side, but we don't care about them as individuals or their well-being or how wholesome they live, then obviously there's no benefit in that. So this is an interesting paradox, right? In order to get the reward of generosity, we have to do it without expecting anything. And this is very similar to our zazen. So when we sit zazen, often people come, to our tradition thinking that they can do zazen to improve their lives in some way, and they get really fixated on that idea. And when they don't see these results, they just give up the practice. And I think that we do see benefits from this practice, but it's only insofar as we can let go of all expectations while we're sitting silently in zazen. If we're sitting there being like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to be so confident when I get up," or whatever, I don't know. It's not going to happen. And then the second story that was mentioned here about the sick sparrow is another sort of classic Chinese tale. So this person finds a sick sparrow that's being attacked by ants. He takes it home, nurses it back to health, and then releases it. Later in life, the sparrow comes to him in a dream, and it appears to him in the form of a yellow-robed boy offering 4 white rings. And according to the story, Yang Bao's family enjoyed prosperity for 4 generations as a result of the sparrow's protection. And you know, these stories have like kind of some weird outgrowths today, just as an aside. So when I was in grad school, I was in Thailand for some work unrelated to Buddhism. But I was already practicing at that time, so I knew a little bit about this kind of thing. And there were all these people on the street that had like birds and turtles. And they were selling them, so you could release them and get good karma from doing that. But of course, it's like totally perverse to do it that way, because they're intentionally capturing the poor things to make money. So it kind of loses its meaning. Obviously, in the story, the person is probably taking this turtle home to eat it, and this guy frees it out of compassion. But if someone's just collecting these things and keeping them in a little cage for people to buy, I don't think that that's very good. But maybe I have too calculating of a mind. I don't know. Okay, so to continue with Dogen's writing here. So we are motivated solely by beneficial action itself, in the case of this turtle and sparrow, for example. Ignorant people may think that if we benefit others too much, our own benefit will be excluded. This is not the case. Beneficial action is the whole of Dharma. It benefits both self and others widely. In an ancient era, a man who tied up his hair 3 times while he took a bath and who stopped eating 3 times in the space of 1 meal solely intended to benefit others. He never withheld instructions from people of other countries. So this is another story that references a sort of Chinese classic. So, Dogen was a very learned guy and knew all these old Chinese tales, and presumably the other learned people that he was with would know these stories. So this one is about a governor who he is in the bath, and people come to ask for his advice, and instead of being like, go away, I'm in the bath, he gets up, he ties up his hair and goes out and helps them, and he does this 3 times. And then the same thing while he's eating a meal, instead of saying, go away, I'm eating, he stops eating, he goes and helps the person. And in this context, he's giving his son advice. So his son is about to go out and become a governor of some other territory, and he says, this is the way that you need to behave. You need to drop everything and benefit others. It's not about your own pleasure. It's about serving others. When I was practicing at Ryumonji's practice period, one of the things that Shoken, the abbot there, was very fond of saying all the time is, you need to have the mind of service, which I think is really good. So when you're, anytime in life, but especially in a temple where you're living with a lot of people, you need to be looking around and thinking, how can I help people? You're not just, there for your own narrow self-interest. Your mind should be one of, how can I identify someone that needs to be served, someone that needs to help? So that's what beneficial action is like. Okay, so moving on here. Therefore, we should equally benefit friends and foes alike. We should benefit self and others alike. So important to note here, he's not saying, completely disregard yourself, and, we also can benefit the self, but, others need to be a part of that as well. Because beneficial actions never regress, if we attain such a mind, we can perform beneficial action even for grass, trees, wind, and water. We should solely strive to help ignorant beings. So this ignorant beings is sort of a specialized Buddhist term, referring to people who are ignorant of the Dharma. One thing that I think is sort of interesting here at the end is this thing about grasses, trees, wind, and water. As someone who's now working as a land steward for my day job, this was appealing to me. And I tried to sort of look at the Japanese original text, but my classical Japanese is not very good. And this was a particularly sort of confusing sentence. And this sort of shows up in Tom Wright's translation of it. He has something rather different. So in this part, he says, if we are able to acquire such an attitude, then naturally we will benefit without ever backsliding or turning away in the same way the grasses and trees or the wind and rivers never turn away. So his interpretation is that this means that grasses, trees, wind, and rivers never backslide. In Hojo-san's understanding, instead the sentence is referring specifically to performing beneficial action for grasses, trees, wind, and water. And from what sense I can make of it, I think that Hojo-san's translation makes more sense. Basically, like, the grammar is weird, but and also they, in the original text, they didn't have any punctuation. You know, it was just continuous letters, basically. But when they put, you know, when they compiled these texts for, you know, modernity, someone added punctuation in. So the way that they added the punctuation here is basically this first line about helping friends and foes alike, benefiting self and others, doing beneficial actions, never regressing, attaining such a mind and performing beneficial actions. And then it's like period, and then it says grass, trees, wind, water also. So you sort of have to piece together for yourself how that fits in. But at any rate, I think that it's a really interesting turn for me, because in the original version of this list of 4, it's clearly aimed at basically humans, you know, because we want them to join the Sangha. But Dogen makes this gesture to grasses and trees and wind and water, and also mentions these stories about non-human beings, of course, too, right? So turtles and sparrows. And in a way, I think that, you know, doing beneficial actions geared at things that can never possibly reciprocate is sort of nice in a way. I feel like it's really difficult as a human not to engage in this sort of quid pro quo sort of thing, to not expect that someone return the favor when you do something nice to them, or to not feel obligated to return the favor when someone does something nice for you. So I think that when we do beneficial action for non-human beings, we really don't have to worry about that. And it's really easier to do this sort of pure action, I think. Another thing that he mentions here that is also mentioned in the Pali text is this notion of, let's see, where was that? It's not jumping to my eye, but where he mentions, you know, the present, past, and future. So we're serving all of those things when we do beneficial action, and I think that that's another space where we can sort of do things that benefit the whole system of interconnectedness, that don't necessarily have their focus on a single person or group of people. So we can do things that will benefit people without it sort of being geared at them, because it's something that will benefit them in the future. And this is something that we, I think, really need to take to heart now, because, you know, we're all engaged in so many things that are detrimental to future generations, not only of humans, but all beings. So taking steps to act in such a way that we think about the future when we do things, I think is really an essential part of this beneficial action. So I will stop there. If there are any sort of questions or comments, please let me know. Yes?
A few years ago, I had lunch with a good friend of mine that he used to come here and practice, usually just on Sundays. He stayed for a World Peace ceremony one time. Mm-hmm. And he kind of went away nonplussed, because he said, what good is this? What, you know, and without thinking about what could be the woo-woo of it, you know, it's, I struggled trying to explain what is good about this.
Yeah.
and I'm wondering if you can talk.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that to start with the woo-woo part, I think that historically that would have been the main thing, right? Is that by doing this ceremony, it really will have this kind of sort of almost magical ripple effect that will go into the world and cause positive action, because as Buddhist practitioners, we're creating good karma, and we have the, scholars talk about this economy of karma, or economy of merit rather. So when we generate merit, we can give it away to others, and so that was sort of the way that it was understood historically. But I think for us now, I think most of us probably don't believe that that will happen of its own accord, in this sort of magical way. But I think that it still has benefit because we're performing it and doing it and thinking about it. And like for me, when I do the world peace ceremony, I might have that same sort of thought, like leading into it, like why do I have to do this? It's just words. But as you say them, you think about them, and you're like, wow, this is good stuff. This is stuff that I should take to heart and do in my life. And so that's, I think, that's at least how I understand it. Is by repeating these things, we sort of create this pathway in our brain to act in this particular way. I think it's the same in reverse. If we're angry all the time, that's gonna be our default way of action. But if we're constantly reinforcing beneficial action in our brains, whether it be through ceremonies or other practices, those things do have effects in the real world, even if they're a little subtle.
So it's really kind of an indirect, or it's still a tangible thing, but it's indirect. So
that's how I would understand it. Yeah.
Well, vow is such an important part of our practice, and when I think about what you say in that echo, the very last thing you say is, may we all from this day on dedicate ourselves, body, speech, and mind to peacefulness. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's vow of repentance right there, which is already such an important part of our practice. It might not be obvious to somebody who's less familiar with what we do here, right? But just, when I think about what your echo actually says, I feel like, okay, from this day on, we hit the reset button. And partly it's helpful because we're hearing these things every 30 days, we hear this. But also we have the opportunity to sort of do the vow again.
Yeah.
And that moment, say, when I leave here, I'm going to shut the light switch off when the room is empty, and I'm going to use less water. I'm going to, say some kind words to somebody, and it's a chance to sort of start over. So in that way, it feels a bit concrete, because we're really saying, we're pledging to actually do some concrete action in the world on the basis of that, right? But I mean, I also over the years have many times had people say, this liturgy thing, what's the good of this? And you struggle to kind of, well, gee, but in the case of that world peace ceremony, it does feel quite immediate to me in a certain kind of way.
Yeah, I think in the sort of discourse about religion in the 21st century, we hear the phrase empty ritual a lot, but that's really up to us if a ritual is empty or not. I mean, we're the ones engaging in it and performing in it. If you're just saying the words and you don't care, then yeah, it is an empty ritual. But if you're really listening to what's being said, then it isn't an empty ritual. And I think that I have some friends who would say that it's really important that we do liturgy in English so you can actually understand what it's saying. And I think that that's valid insofar as we can't really know what we're really engage with what we're saying unless it's in English. I think there are other reasons maybe to do it in Japanese, insofar as it sort of creates a bridge between us and the tradition for people that want to practice there in the future. But I think understanding what you're saying is really important, even if it is in a foreign language. It's taking the time to investigate what that means, and so that when you say it, you realize what the content of your speech is. So.
I wouldn't make a case for magic, though.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I believe in magic. That is, there's a paranormal dimension to our existence. I mean, telepathy is real. And I think Whitehead said, Alfred Whitehead, to make it, all you have to do to change everything is move your little finger, because everything is so interconnected with everything that any difference makes all the difference.
Yeah.
And so many years ago now, back in the 1970s, the first Asian system of meditation I learned was TM, the Maharishi, because the Beatles were doing it and they were cool. And there was some kind of empirical study that they cited that when a certain number of people within a community meditate, it actually seems to influence the community so that things like crime rates and things like that actually drop. Now, I never verified whether these studies are scientifically sound or not, but they sound sort of at least romantically plausible. So I'm inclined to believe that just maybe benevolent thoughts within the mind of any one individual has a ripple effect throughout the entire time-space continuum. Sort of like consciousness has a non-locality dimension to it, and there's such an interconnectedness that just putting love in your heart will radiate love for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, maybe to tie the two sides together, I think that regardless of what you believe about it, whether or not there's this magical effect, or if you're sort of more of a materialist or something, you don't really think that, behaving in that way is going to have the same effect. So if we act as if it is magical, we will be producing the magical effect. So like you said, if we are practicing in a community, if we have love in our hearts, in one way or another, that's rubbing off on other people. So I think that's perfectly valid.
Oh, I love your perspective.
Other thoughts or comments? Yeah.
I think, kind of to riff off of that, there's a interesting thing about words and their meaning. I think, whether in a magical sense or not, even in a completely mundane sense, words have power. I think, even in a deeper sense, obviously we can kind of break it down to the psychological effect of, like, we say these things and then focus on these things and then go do those things. I think that's true. And also, even keeping it in the mundane realm, there's something deeper than that happening with words. And I think we can take this kind of to an existential place of the enterprise of, like, meaning making, of, from an existentialist point of view, there is no inherent meaning. We make all meaning. But also, that meaning is real because we have made it. So therefore, these words we are saying, in a ritual standpoint, have some power in our lives that is deep and significant, which makes it worth doing, right?
Yeah, I think that related to that, when we have the getting started here, sometimes people ask about karma, and like rebirth and stuff, and they're like, either do you really like believe in that, or on the flip side, some people are like, oh, I came here because rebirth, and that's really cool. So what I sort of say is like, if we follow the Buddhist teaching, and rebirth is real, then we're well taken care of in that system, whether or not we believe it or not. It's sort of like Pascal's wager, I guess, if you're familiar with that, but in sort of, it doesn't require like any special faith or anything. It's not a tenet of Buddhism that you like have to believe in a particular cosmology. It's much more about how do you live a wholesome life. So, but going to meaning, words and meaning things, that reminded me of, over the holidays, I was with my brother, and my brother's an alcoholic, and at one point he said something that was like really mean to me, and I hadn't been with him for a while, so I sort of like I didn't have it in my mind like, like when he says these things, it's not really like he means to say them, it's just kind of, he can't really help himself, but still it had this really like deep impact on me, and for the next like couple of days I was like really annoyed. And then I sort of had to like convince myself that like, oh, he doesn't really know what he's saying. So yeah, we can talk all we want about like how words are just words, but when we hear them, we have instinctual reactions. So yeah, they are powerful.
So back to beneficial action, when you use the word proselytizing,
Mm-hmm.
that I had a reaction to that because when I think to myself, and I'm sort of, I don't know, obsessed with this motivations.
Mm-hmm.
So like there's a pretty popular saying, everybody hates salesmen, and it's because a salesman will be nice to you, but he wants something in return,
Right. Yeah.
and his end is probably going to be the bigger profit, right?
Mhm.
And none of us like that sort of relationship where it's intentional, using kindness to get something in return.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really I enjoyed the idea of the magnet,
Yeah.
because a magnet attracts not because it's not because of anything other than that it's a magnet.
Mm-hmm.
So if we practice and we're kind because that's what we do, because we are practitioners, then it's a more natural thing than saying, I'm going to be nice to somebody and maybe they'll come to my church or
Yeah,
whatever.
exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really good point. And the thing about the magnet that I find interesting is, sometimes people talk, they're like, what is it like to be the Buddha, a Buddha? Because the Buddha has extinguished all karma, and if you think about it, it must just sort of be like automatically kind of reacting with just the right thing without any sort of like input internally as to like, oh, this is going to be good for me or bad for me or whatever. Like, I like this, I don't like that. None of that is supposed to be going on. So some like Buddhist studies scholars say that the Buddha is sort of like a thermometer. It reacts to things in just the right way, but there's no like sort of internal feeling or anything. And this is sort of like the magnet idea in a way. Not saying we should or can be like a thermometer, but at least the way that the Buddha is sometimes described, you might get that impression. So, yes.
So, just I feel like called speaking, like
Yeah.
Quaker kind of way. So the term metanoic is a Greek term that's in the Christian world, and it has to do with turning to see the new way.
Mm.
And so it's kind of the positive spin on being saved, I think, or proselytizing from that sense. So as I was listening to your talk, I was trying to sort, so where is that bit of mystical component there? Because I always kind of consider Buddhism being overgeneralizing, of course, my ignorance, but taking just that next benevolent step, embodied. And so I'm trying to work that out in my mind. Is that a metanoic thing? Or is that, I don't know, overthinking?
No, I think that's there's a anecdote that comes to mind when you were speaking about the Dalai Lama. So of course we have lots of like Dalai Lama stuff in our culture and books about him and so forth. But there's the story of like when he was at a hotel to like give, while he was giving a series of talks or something. And he has this big sort of entourage when he travels around, obviously, because he's a famous person and security and whatever. But embodying this practice that we're talking about, these embracing actions, he as he was going in, like stopped to chat with a lot of the people who were working at the hotel, and really embraced them. And it said that by the end of his visit, the whole like hotel staff was lined up every day, whenever he would come and go, because he had just had this magnetic attraction, And I don't know if any of those people went on to become Buddhists, but you can imagine that maybe they did, maybe they got interested. So I don't think that was his goal at all, was to be like, how am I going to turn this hotel staff into Buddhists, but he's just doing his practice, which is, identity action, treating everyone like you would like to be treated, and I think that's just the effect that it has. So yeah, metanoic, I think, seems right.
Anyone else in this room? Is there anyone in the gallery that has a question or comment?
I do. So I remember like both the Lotus Sutra and I think King Ashoka both had like lists of rules for like how to proselytize. And I remember one that really stood out to me was do not preach the Dharma to someone who seems uninterested. And, you know, sort of like, I think that part of what annoys people with a lot of like, you know, proselytizers is that like they'll knock on your door to speak to you or harass you in the street or some busy place. And something that I was kind of curious is like if there were other examples of sort of these lists and what some common themes were, because I noticed some common themes between Ashoka and the Lotus Sutras regulations, but I've not really encountered them anywhere else.
I know that, you know, some of the Vinaya precepts that you know, non-Japanese Buddhist monks monks and nuns take, include regulations on how to speak about the Dharma. Like, and some of them seem sort of weird in modern context. Like, I think one is like you can't preach the Dharma to someone who's sitting down, like if you're standing up, because it suggests that they're like you know, kind of disrespecting the Dharma or something. You know, you're not on the same level. And I think there's ones about like the footwear that people are wearing and this kind of thing. So those come to mind. Not very helpful, I know. But I'd say check out the list of Vinaya regulations. There are probably others that are more pertinent, that should have stuck in my head rather than the goofy ones. But yeah, I know that there's something there. But yeah, I'm not super well versed beyond that. So.
Any other questions?
I have one more late question. I'm wondering if you know anything about like with Dogen, we always tend to talk about like who his intended audience was, and it's usually his monks, and so that has sort of different implications for us not living in the monastery with him. But I know that like in Zuimoki, he uses a lot of classical Chinese stories that are like people out in the marketplace doing something, and then this is an example for the monks to, you know, be that determined or be that wholehearted. And so I'm wondering if in this case, do we know, is this a text that he gave to his monks and said, do beneficial actions, you know, to each other in the temple? Or were there like lay students receiving this? Because it feels like a very broad description of beneficial action in or out of the temple.
Yeah. Hojo-san talks about this in his commentary on the text. So it was written in 1243, I think, which was the year that Dogen moved from Kyoto to Echizen, so out in the countryside. And you know, we don't really have any clear documentary evidence of why he made this sudden move, but it's sort of generally thought that there was pressure, violent or otherwise, from the sort of Buddhist establishment in Kyoto that basically was like, you know, you're attracting too many students and we don't like what you're teaching, you better get the hell out of here, or, you know, trouble's gonna ensue. Sort of the general thought of why he left. And so this text was written, so it was right after the summer practice period that they left to establish Eiheiji, what would become Eiheiji. And so this was written during the summer practice period. And Hojo-san notes that, you know, it's really interesting at a time of kind of strife, of being sort of pressured by your, you know, what you would normally perceive as your enemies. He's saying, you know, we need to do beneficial action both for our friends and our enemies. So it sort of seems like that, you know, potentially the context of this was to encourage his students not to, you know, get involved with reprisals either in their head or like actually as this stuff was happening. So I think that that is kind of the intended context. I think it was, so it was presented during the summer practice period, so almost certainly just for monks and nuns, but not for lay people probably, unless they were coming into the temple to listen to his talks, which might have happened. I'm not really sure how that worked exactly, but I think primarily it would have been his monastic students.
Anyone else? Shall we wrap it up?
Sure. Thank you.